Get that wheelchair off the lawn before the Suttons see it. This is a $500,000 wedding, not a charity ward. The words came from a woman in a headset and a black blazer, her voice pitched low but not low enough, aimed at the security guard beside her rather than at the man she was talking about, as though Wyatt Calloway weren't sitting close. Enough to hear every syllable, as though the gravel path beneath his wheels made him invisible, as well as inconvenient. He said nothing. He rarely did in moments like this. He simply eased his chair 3 feet farther from the white event tent, out past the low boxwood hedge, into the long shade of an oak tree, where nobody would trip over him on their way to the open bar. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now? And which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. And there was a particular private irony in it that Wyatt had stopped finding funny around the age of 26. The fact that the coordinator scowling at him owned a car worth less than the tie he'd left folded in his glove box that morning, the fact that if she knew his name, if she so much as guessed at the balance sitting quietly in the accounts behind Calloway Stringworks, she would have carried him to the best seat in the house on her own back. But she didn't know. Nobody at Sweetbriar Hall knew. That was the point. He'd come tonight as a favor to a supplier, an old friend of his late father's who'd begged him to make an appearance at his granddaughter's engagement party 2 tenths over a small, forgettable obligation that had put him entirely by accident within sight of the Sutton wedding's grand white pavilion an hour before the ceremony was set to begin. He hadn't planned to stay. But something about the golden light through the string bulbs, the smell of gardenias so thick it reached him 30 yards away. The sheer unbothered abundance of it all had rooted him to the spot. The way certain kinds of beauty always did, quietly, from the outside, the way a man presses his forehead, a window he was never meant to walk through. He knew that window well. He had grown up on the wrong side of enough of them. There had been a winter when Wyatt was 11 that he still carried in his body more than his memory, a cold that got into the joints and stayed there into the walls of the trailer he shared with his father behind the old Calloway repair shop before the company was anything at all, back when Calloway meant a leaking roof and a space heater that only worked if you kicked it twice. He remembered the sound his stomach made in that quiet, the particular shame of a hunger you learn not to mention out loud, because there was nothing anyone could do about it. He remembered his father's hands cracked and yellow with wood varnish, wrapping a single blanket around both of them, because there wasn't a second one, and the two of them listening to the wind find every gap in the walls like it was hunting for them personally. Warmth back then had not been a temperature. It had been the fact that someone stayed. He did not think of himself as poor anymore. The word felt like it belonged to another man, a boy who no longer existed except in the marrow of him and the part of his mind that still 20 years and hundreds of millions of dollars later flinched when a waiter set down a plate of food. He hadn't finished, and hovered to ask if something was wrong with it. Wealth had covered him like a coat. It had never once reached the cold underneath. The commotion started with a sound Wyatt would later be unable to fully explain. Not a scream, not yet, but a kind of collective intake of breath, 300 voices catching at once, the particular hush that falls over a crowd right before it erupts. Through the gauze curtains of the dressing tent, he saw shapes moving too fast. A door slamming open. A woman's voice, high and furious, cutting through the string quartet that faltered and died mid-phrase. "It is exactly what it looks like," the voice said. "It has been what it looks like for 11 months. Wyatt did not know the bride's name yet. He would learn it within the hour, though he could not have said, sitting there in the shadow of that oak tree with his hands gone still on the wheels of his chair, that the sound of her voice, raw, disbelieving, breaking open in real time in front of everyone she had ever loved, would lodge itself somewhere in his chest and simply refuse to leave. 2 uniformed officers moved through the crowd toward the tent's center, unhurried, procedural, the way men move when the outcome of a thing is already decided and all that's left is the paperwork. Wyatt heard fragments, fraud wire transfers, a sister's name spoken like a curse, and watched as a young man in a tuxedo was led out by the elbow, protesting, his voice cracking with the particular indignation of someone caught rather than someone innocent. Behind him came an older man, Wyatt would later know as Richard Sutton, purple with rage, and beside him a woman in a mother-of-the-bride gown the color of a bruise, her mouth already forming words that Wyatt understood before he heard them would be unforgivable. "This girl is no longer a Sutton," Richard said loud enough to carry to the parking lot, loud enough that the string quartet didn't even try to resume. "I disown her. Completely." The bride came stumbling out of the tent a moment later, and Wyatt's breath caught somewhere behind his ribs in a way he didn't have a name for yet. She was still in the dress, ivory silk, gone gray, with dust at the hem, one strap slipping off a bare shoulder, her veil torn and hanging by a single pin like something that had survived a storm rather than a wedding. Two ushers flanked her, not gently, one of them yanking a small clutch purse out of her hands hard enough that she stumbled. Someone behind her was shouting that everything on her, every thread, had been bought with Sutton money, and she should leave it all, every ring, every earring on the gravel, where it belonged. She didn't fight them. That was the part that undid him. She simply stood very straight in the wreckage of her own wedding chin, lifted eyes bright and dry in the specific way of someone who has decided mid-collapse that she will not give the crowd the satisfaction of her tears, and Wyatt Calloway, who had learned a long time ago how to read the blank provet. The difference between a person who is broken and a person who has simply run out of places left to bleed. Understood in that instant that he was looking at the second kind. Out her father's voice cracked across the lawn one final time. "Throw her out of this hall." The crowd parted like something ashamed of itself. Nobody moved to help her. Somewhere behind him, the wedding coordinator who'd called Wyatt a charity case was already on her phone, rebooking the tent for a different event entirely, as though a woman's whole life hadn't just ended 11 feet away from her clipboard. Wyatt sat very still beneath the oak tree, hands resting on the wheels of his chair, and felt something in his chest turn over that he could not at first identify, not pity exactly, though there was some of that. Something closer to recognition. He knew what it felt like to be discarded by the people who were supposed to keep you. He knew what it felt like to become overnight a name nobody in a room wanted attached to theirs. He had simply never watched it happen to someone else. In real time, in the gold evening light, in a dress that had cost more than most people's cars, and felt the whole architecture of his own carefully guarded heart, lean just slightly toward a stranger he had not yet spoken a single word to. She walked past him without seeing him, barefoot on the gravel, her shoes lost somewhere behind her in the tent. And Wyatt Calloway, tycoon ghost, the boy who once slept under one blanket in a Tennessee winter, found that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not thinking about the cold. He was thinking about her. The parking lot at Sweetbriar Hall stretched out long and dark beyond the reach of the string light's gravel, giving way to asphalt valet stands standing empty now that no one wanted their car brought around in the middle of a scandal. Claire Sutton walked until the noise of the tent behind her thinned into something distant and unreal, until her bare feet found the curb outside a shuttered gas station a quarter-mile down the road, and there finally, her knees simply stopped agreeing to hold her. She didn't cry. That was the strange part. The part she would turn over in her own mind for weeks. Afterward, she sat down hard on the cold concrete ivory silk pooling gray around her, and felt nothing so much as a vast, ringing silence where a person's whole future was supposed to be. Somewhere behind her, a life had ended. In front of her, there was nothing yet built to replace it. Wyatt Calloway had followed at a distance. He told himself was accidental. His van idling at the far end of the lot, the driver he rarely used waiting with the engine running, and Wyatt simply unable in the end to give the order to pull away. He told himself he was only making sure someone called her a ride. That was the story he was telling himself when he wheeled himself out of the van's lift and across the cracked asphalt toward the curb, where a stranger in a wedding gown sat alone under a flickering gas station sign looking at nothing. He didn't say anything grand. He never did. "You don't have to talk," he said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away, close enough to be heard, far enough not to crowd her. "I just didn't like the idea of you sitting out here by yourself." Claire looked up at him slowly, and something in her face, some deep, exhausted recognition, seemed to catch on the sight of him. Not the wheelchair. Something else. The stillness in him. The way he'd stopped a careful arm's length away instead of looming, the way his eyes held no trace of the pity or curiosity she'd been drowning in all evening. "You were under the oak tree," she said. "Not a question." "I was. They told you to move." "They did." A faint wry twist at the corner of his mouth gone almost as soon as it appeared. "I've been told to move my whole life. I've gotten good at finding new trees." She let out something that wasn't quite a laugh, more like air escaping a wound, and looked back down at her ruined dress at her bare feet, gone numb against the concrete. My father just disowned me in front of 300 people, she said, flat disbelieving as though saying it aloud might finally make it real. My fiancé was sleeping with my sister for 11 months. They took my purse, my phone, even my shoes. A small broken breath. I don't have anywhere to go tonight. I don't have anywhere to go at all. Wyatt didn't reach for her. He'd learned a long time ago that comfort offered too fast could feel like one more hand closing around something a person hadn't agreed to give. He simply sat with her in the quiet, in the buzzing fluorescent light, and let the silence hold whatever it needed to hold. It was Claire who broke it, and when she did, her voice had changed steadier, stripped of its earlier devastation, replaced by something closer to reckless clarity, the particular fearlessness of a person who has already lost everything a room he can take from her, and finds on the other side of that loss an unexpected freedom. "Marry me," she said. Wyatt went very still. "I don't know your name," Claire went on faster now, as though the words might dissolve if she slowed down. "I don't know anything about you. You could be the worst thing that's ever happened to me. But you looked at me tonight the way nobody in that entire hall has looked at me in my whole life, and I have nothing left to lose, and I would rather marry a stranger who saw me than go back and beg the people who just threw me away like garbage." For a long moment, Wyatt said nothing at all. Somewhere behind his ribs, something that had been locked shut for 6 years, since a burning car, since a hospital hallway, since a woman he'd loved walking out of a door and never once looking back, shifted just slightly the way old hinges give when enough weight finally leans against them. He thought of the trailer. He thought of the blanket and the wind finding every gap in the walls, and his father's hands, and the particular loneliness of being wealthy enough now to buy almost anything, except the one thing he actually wanted, which was simply matter to someone who didn't already know what he was. Worth on paper. "My name is Wyatt," he said quietly. "And my answer is yes." An hour later, in the flat fluorescent hush of the county courthouse's after-hours chapel, a modest room usually reserved for quick civil ceremonies, its walls lined with silk flowers gone slightly dusty, a startled notary public who, moonlit, as an officiant found herself marrying a barefoot woman in a torn wedding gown, to a man in a wheelchair with no guests, no rings beyond a plain band. Wyatt happened to have kept in his jacket pocket from another lifetime, and no music, but the hum of the building's old air conditioning. "If there is any person here," the notary began, glancing uncertainly at the empty rows of folding chairs, "who knows a lawful reason these two should not be joined." The door banged open. Brett Sanders stood in the frame-tie loosened jacket, gone his face, a livid mixture of humiliation and fury that had clearly been building the entire drive over. Behind him, breathless, came a security guard who'd apparently lost the argument about letting him in. "Not a lawful reason," Brett said, striding forward, his eyes fixed on Claire with something close to hatred. "A truthful one. This town ought to know exactly what family it's dealing with." Brett, Claire said, low warning. "Don't." "No," he said. "I think I will. You want to stand here and play the wounded saint? Fine. Let's talk about how you're not even Richard Sutton's real daughter, not the one he raised in that house on the hill anyway. That's Madison. You're the one he hid out at his aunt's place in Coffee County for years, because you weren't the daughter he wanted people to see." His voice cracked with something that might have been shame, might have been spite. "Ask him yourself why one daughter went to a private school in Nashville, and the other one grew up patching drywall for rent money." The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular density of a truth finally let loose in a room too small to contain it. Claire's face didn't crumble the way Brett clearly wanted it to. Instead, something in her straightened. "I already knew that," she said quietly. "What I didn't know is that you'd stand in a courthouse and use it to try to hurt me one more time before I stopped being yours to hurt at all." She turned to the notary, whose pen hovered uncertainly over the marriage license. "Please, continue." Brett's jaw worked. He looked for one final moment at Wyatt, taking in the wheelchair, the plain jacket, the complete absence of anything he recognized as a threat, and something ugly and satisfied crossed his face, the look of a man who believes he's found the last card left to play. "Enjoy your future," he said to Claire, backing toward the door. "A disgraced woman and a man in a wheelchair. Let's see who's laughing in a year." He was gone before anyone could answer him. The security guard shut the door quietly behind them both, and for a moment the little chapel held nothing but the sound of the air conditioning and Claire's unsteady breathing. Wyatt reached over slowly and took her hand, the first time he had touched her at all. Her fingers were freezing. His were warm, calloused in a way that told a story he hadn't shared with her yet, and steady the way a man's hands are steady when he has already decided somewhere deep and quiet inside himself that he will not let go. "I don't know what happened to you before tonight," he said, "and I don't need to know it all right now. but I know what it looks like when someone spent years trying to make you small enough to fit in a box they built for you. I've spent years in one myself." He held her gaze something raw and unguarded, moving behind his eyes for just a moment before he tucked it carefully back down. "What at Claire, a disgraced woman and a broken man, we get to decide that's not the whole story." The notary, visibly moved despite herself, cleared her throat. "Shall I finish the ceremony?" Claire looked down at their joined hands, his solid and sure, hers still trembling faintly at the edges, and for the first time since the tent had erupted into chaos behind her, felt something in her chest ease, just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. "Please," she said. Outside the chapel windows, the Tennessee night had gone fully dark, the parking lot lights humming faintly against a sky scattered with stars neither of them thought to look up and see. Neither of them could have known in that fluorescent little room with its dusty silk flowers that the true test of what they'd just promised each other was still ahead of them, hidden behind a plain wooden door, in a modest rented duplex across town in Scars, in a name that would take weeks to surface and change everything. For tonight it was enough that two people who had each been discarded by someone who was supposed to love them had found in the wreckage of the worst night of Claire's life a single, steady hand willing to hold on. The duplex sat on a narrow street on the east side of town, wedged between a laundromat with a flickering sign and a chain-link fence overtaken by honeysuckle, the kind of block where porch lights burned all night, not for safety but for company. Wyatt's van pulled up just past midnight, its headlights sweeping briefly over a sagging mailbox and a patch of yard gone more clover than grass, and Claire still in the ruined remains of her wedding gown, a borrowed flannel jacket from the notary's coat closet, draped over her bare shoulders, sat very still in the passenger seat, staring up at the small brick building like it belonged to someone else's life. "This is it," Wyatt said, an odd, careful note of apology threading through his voice as though he expected her to recoil. "It isn't much. It's more than I have," Claire said quietly, and meant it. The porch light came on before they'd even reached the steps, a small, round-shouldered woman in her 70s appearing in the doorway in a housecoat and slippers, silver hair pinned up haphazardly, her face breaking into an expression of open, unguarded delight the moment she saw who was climbing out of the van behind Wyatt. "Well, would you look at this," the woman said, hurrying down the steps despite Wyatt's protest that she didn't need to. Wyatt Calloway coming home after midnight with a woman on his arm, pardon me, in his passenger seat, dressed like she walked straight out of a magazine. "Lord have mercy, child, come here. You look like you've been through a war." "Miss Odessa," Wyatt said, something in his shoulders visibly loosening at the sight of her, the way a man's posture changes around the one person in his life who has never once asked him for anything. "This is Claire, my wife." Odessa Grant went very still for exactly 1 second, taking in the torn veil still pinned crookedly in Claire's hair, the mismatched jacket, the bare and dirty feet, and then without a single question opened her arms. "Then she's mine too," Odessa said simply, and pulled Claire into a hug that smelled of lavender soap and fried okra, the kind of embrace that asked nothing and gave everything, the kind Claire hadn't received from a single member of her own family in longer than she could remember. Inside, the duplex was small and clean and worn soft at every edge. A threadbare couch with a hand-crocheted blanket folded over its arm, a kitchen table with one leg propped level by a folded matchbook, framed photographs on the wall that Claire didn't yet recognize as belonging to a man's whole hidden history. There was nothing here that spoke of wealth, nothing that hinted even faintly at the numbers that lived quietly behind Wyatt Calloway's name in banks 3 states away, and that, Claire would come to understand in the weeks ahead, was entirely the point. Odessa fussed over both of them, a plate of cornbread appearing from nowhere, a cup of chamomile tea pressed into Claire's hands, whether she wanted it or not, until satisfied that her boy and his new bride were fed and settled. She retreated to her own half of the duplex with a final, meaningful look at Wyatt that Claire couldn't quite decode, and the door clicked softly shut behind her. For a long moment, silence settled over the small living room, thick with everything neither of them had said yet. "You don't have to explain anything to me tonight," Claire said, finally watching him from across the room, still cradling the mug of tea she hadn't drunk. "I know this is strange. I know I'm strange showing up in your life like a hurricane made of somebody else's wreckage." "You're not strange," Wyatt said, quiet, certain. "You're the first thing that's happened to me in 6 years that didn't feel like it was already decided before I got a say in it." Something in the way he said it, the specific weight behind 6 years, made Claire go still. He must have seen the question form in her before she asked it, because he reached up slowly, deliberately, and rolled back the cuff of his shirt. In the low lamplight, the scarring along his forearm was unmistakable, pale, ropey, the unmistakable topography of old, deep burns that had healed wrong in places, The kind of scars that told a story no plastic surgeon's careful hand had ever been allowed to soften. Car accident, he said. 6 years ago. A fire got into the cab before anyone could pull me out. It's why I don't walk anymore. It's most of why I don't do a lot of things anymore. His voice had gone flat. Practiced the tone of a man reciting a story he'd told so many times to keep people from asking follow-up questions that the words had worn smooth, lost their edges. My family settled me with a monthly allowance. And this house, out here where nobody from their circles would ever have a reason to drive past, and made it very clear they'd prefer if I stayed that way. Invisible. Manageable. A liability with a lid kept firmly on it. Claire set the tea down on the coffee table, her hands no longer entirely steady, and crossed the small room to sit beside him, not too close, careful of a boundary she didn't yet understand the shape of, but close enough that she wasn't flinching from what he'd shown. Her. That's not family, she said quietly. That's a very expensive way of throwing someone out. Something shifted behind Wyatt's eyes' surprise, maybe that she'd landed on exactly the words he'd never quite let himself say out loud. You'd know something about that tonight, he said. I would. A small, tired, almost rueful smile. I guess between the two of us we make one whole family that actually wants us. They sat with that for a while, the old refrigerator humming faintly in the next room, moths circling the porch light visible through a gap in the curtains, and Claire found herself studying the small apartment again, really looking this time. The way a person looks at a place they're trying to memorize. Her eyes caught on a battered guitar case propped in the corner near the window, its leather worn pale at the corners, a strip of duct tape holding one hinge together. May I? She asked, nodding toward it. Wyatt hesitated just barely, just long enough that Claire noticed before he nodded. She lifted the case onto her lap with the particular reverence of someone who had grown up around instruments, the way other people grow up around books, unlatched it carefully, and folded back the worn velvet lining. The guitar inside was old, its finish gone amber and crackled with age, clearly a working instrument rather than a display piece, loved into its wear rather than neglected into it. And there, tucked into the small pocket meant for spare strings, was a folded paper repair tag. Yellowed at the edges, the ink gone soft and brown with time. Claire's breath caught somewhere in her chest before her mind had even fully processed why. She knew that handwriting. She had grown up watching that exact, looping, careful script fill out 100 identical tags in a small repair shop that smelled of sawdust and lacquer. A shop that had closed its doors the year she turned 16 and never opened them. Again. Wyatt, she said very carefully, her voice gone thin. Where did you get this guitar? He looked at her, something in his expression shifting from confusion to a kind of wary attention sensing, before he understood why that the question mattered far more than its simple words led on. It was my father's, he said slowly. One of the only things of his I kept. Why? Claire turned the tag over in trembling fingers, and there beneath a faded repair date and a price written in a hand she would have recognized anywhere on earth was a single line she'd read 1,000 times as a child without ever once imagining it would find her again decades later, in a stranger's living room on the far side of a wedding that had ended her old life, only hours before. No charge. Good men shouldn't have to choose between eating and keeping their music. Suttons String and Repair. Claire looked up at Wyatt, and for the first time since the gas station curb, since the courthouse chapel, since the vows exchanged in a room that smelled of dust and silk flowers, she understood with a sudden dizzying certainty that whatever force had put her on that curb tonight had not been chance at all. That's my father's handwriting, she whispered. My father repaired this guitar. Outside, somewhere down the quiet street, a dog barked once and fell silent, and the porch light flickered against the honeysuckle, and inside the small, worn, honest little duplex, two people who had each been discarded by families too blind to see what they were losing, sat frozen in the lamplight, beginning without either of them fully realizing it, yet to understand that their two broken lives had been quietly, invisibly tangled together long before either of them had ever spoken a single word to the other. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The old refrigerator clicked off in the next room, and the sudden quiet felt enormous, as though the whole house were holding its breath along with them. Sutton, Wyatt said, finally testing the word like it might shift under his weight. Your father was a luthier. A repairman, mostly, Claire said, still staring down at the tag as though it might dissolve if she looked away. Guitars, mandolins, the odd fiddle that came in from a church group. He had a little shop on the edge of downtown before the money came into our family and swallowed everything that used to make sense about us. Her thumb traced the faded ink, without quite touching it, as if the letters themselves might still be warm. He believed a person shouldn't have to be rich to keep the one thing that made their life bearable. He fixed instruments for free more often than my mother ever knew, and when she found out there were fights I wasn't supposed to hear. Wyatt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My father used to bring instruments into town from every county around here, he said, slowly working backward through a memory he hadn't touched in years. Before Calloway Stringworks was anything but a workshop behind a feed store, before we had 2 nickels to rub together, he had a guitar, his only good one, the one he'd play on the porch some nights when he thought I was asleep, and the neck cracked clean through one winter. We didn't have the money to fix it. I remember him wrapping it in a moving blanket like it was something dying. He looked up at her, something unsteady moving behind his eyes. He came back from town a week later with it playing better than it ever had. Wouldn't tell me how he'd paid for it. Just said a good man had done him a kindness he intended to spend the rest of his life returning. Claire felt something crack open behind her ribs, gentle and enormous at once. That was him, she whispered. That was exactly the kind of thing he did. Later that night, long after Odessa's porch light had gone dark and the duplex had settled into the particular hush of 2 people lying awake in adjoining rooms unable to sleep for entirely different reasons, Wyatt sat alone at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the blue glow, the only light in the house. He told himself he was simply checking the foundation's quarterly disbursements, the way he did most nights when sleep wouldn't come, a habit born less of diligence than of the particular loneliness of a man who trusted numbers more easily than people. But his fingers, moving almost on their own, typed a name into the search field of the Calloway Family Foundation's donor-advised grant records, Sutton String and Repair. The record that surfaced stopped his breath. 5 years of quarterly transfers, modest but unbroken, routed through the foundation's small business hardship fund under a line item marked in the deliberately vague language his own legal team had drafted for him years ago. Anonymous benefactor undisclosed. Before that, a single larger transfer, debt relief, back taxes, a mortgage on a shuttered storefront, brought current just before the county could seize it, timed almost exactly to the year Claire had said the shop closed. And beneath all of it, buried 3 folders deep in a grant application. He barely remembered approving a youth music scholarship fund, quietly keeping 6 kids a year in lessons and instruments in a small Tennessee county he'd chosen all those years ago for no reason he could name at. The time beyond a vague, aching pull he'd never examined too closely. He had done all of it himself. He simply hadn't known until this exact moment whose life he'd been quietly holding up in the dark. He sat very still at the kitchen table, the laptop's light flickering faintly against his face, and felt something enormous and disorienting move through his chest. Not quite joy, not quite grief, something closer to the vertigo of a man, discovering that a hand he thought was his alone had been resting on someone else's shoulder for years without his knowledge. He didn't tell her that night. He wasn't sure, sitting there in the dark, that he had the words for it yet. The next morning, sunlight came slanting through the thin curtains of the guest room, where Claire had finally fallen into a shallow, restless sleep sometime near dawn, still in the borrowed flannel jacket, the ruined wedding gown folded carefully over a chair, as though putting it away gently might undo some of what had happened in it. She woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of Wyatt's voice in the kitchen, and for one disorienting moment, lying in an unfamiliar bed, in an unfamiliar house, she forgot entirely what her life had become in the space of a single day. Then it came back to her all at once: the tent, the officers, her father's voice cracking across the lawn, the curb, the courthouse, the tag, inside the guitar case, and she lay very still, letting it settle over her like weather. At breakfast, Wyatt was quieter than he'd been the night before, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands, working up to something. Claire noticed and said nothing, learning already the particular rhythm of a man who needed room to arrive at his own words rather than be rushed toward them. "I looked something up last night," he said finally, "after you'd gone to sleep." He told her then, carefully watching her face the whole time, as though bracing for a reaction he couldn't predict about the foundation records, the anonymous transfers, the mortgage brought current in the exact year her family shop had closed, the scholarship fund that had quietly kept children in her hometown playing music for 6 without either of them ever knowing the thread that connected it back to a burning car and a locked-away heir on the far side of the county. Claire set down her coffee very slowly, her hands not quite steady. "You've been keeping my father's legacy alive," she said, "since before we ever met." "I didn't know it was his." Wyatt said something raw and unguarded, finally breaking through the careful composure he usually kept wrapped around himself like a second skin. "I didn't know any of the names. I just knew there was a shop that used to matter to somebody, and it didn't feel right letting it disappear because the world had decided it wasn't profitable enough to save." He looked at her, and for the first time since the gas station curb, Claire saw something close to fear in his eyes, the specific fear of a man who has just discovered that fate, or something very much like it, had been quietly weaving two broken lives together for years, waiting for the exact night neither of them would have chosen to finally pull the threads taut. "I don't believe in accidents," Claire said, softly reaching across the small kitchen table to still his restless hands with her own. "Not anymore. Not after this." Outside, the morning traffic on the street had picked up ordinary and indifferent to the two people sitting in the small kitchen, turning over the wreckage and the miracle of the last 12 hours in equal measure. Wyatt looked down at her hand, resting over his steady, now warm, entirely unafraid of the scars beneath it, and felt for the first time in 6 years the particular vertigo of a locked door somewhere deep inside him beginning very slowly to give way. He did not yet know how much further that door would have to open before the truth of his own family's silence came fully into the light. He did not yet know about the wire transfer buried years deep in his mother's records, waiting like a second fault line beneath the first. For this one quiet morning in a small kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood, and the particular hush that follows a storm, it was enough to know that some kindnesses outlive the people who forget they ever gave them, and that some threads once pulled refuse to let go until the whole cloth has been remade. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected, small, quiet, unremarkable in a way that felt, after the violence of the wedding, almost dangerously peaceful. Claire learned the creak of the third porch step the hour Odessa liked to hang laundry, the particular silence Wyatt fell into each evening around dusk that she'd come to understand without being told as the hour his body remembered. The accident most acutely. She did not push. She simply stayed nearby, close enough to be a presence, far enough to leave him room. It was a Tuesday night, though neither of them would have called it that, weeks blurring the way they do when a person is busy rebuilding a life from nothing, when the quiet finally broke. Claire found him at the kitchen table well past midnight, the same blue laptop glow from days before now dark, the machine closed and pushed aside. Wyatt simply sitting with his hands folded in front of him, staring at nothing. She almost turned back toward the bedroom, unwilling to intrude on whatever private country he'd wandered into. Then she saw his shoulders, the particular rigid stillness of a man holding something back by sheer force of will, and she crossed the room instead, and sat down across from him without a word. "You don't have to talk," she said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the exact words he'd offered her on the curb outside the gas station weeks before. Wyatt let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, some third thing with no clean name. "Funny," he said. "That's what I said to you. I remember." He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing an old water ring on the table's surface, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register. Claire hadn't heard from him before, younger, rougher at the edges, a voice that belonged to a version of him he usually kept locked away. Behind the calm, steady chairman's cadence he wore like armor. Before the accident, he said there was a woman, Delilah, a graduate student at Vanderbilt studying architecture, the kind of sharp and funny that made a room feel like it had better lighting whenever she walked into it. A faint, involuntary softness crossed his face at the memory, quickly followed by something harder. "I was going to marry her. I had the ring picked out for almost a year before I ever worked up the nerve to ask. I used to think that if I'd just been a little braver, a little faster, none of what came after would have had the chance to happen the way it did." Claire said nothing, only watched him, letting the silence hold space for whatever needed to come next. Right around the time the hostile takeover rumors first hit Calloway Stringworks before the crash, before any of it, I watched her start pulling away. Wyatt went on. Small things at first. Canceled dinners. A phone that went to voicemail more than it used to. I told myself it was stress, her thesis, anything but what it actually was. His jaw tightened. Then the accident happened. 6 weeks in a hospital bed, more surgeries than I care to count. And when I finally came home in this chair for the first time, do you know how long it took her to disappear completely? Claire shook her head slowly, dreading the answer. "A week," Wyatt said. "No note, no conversation, just a moving truck outside her apartment building and a text message 3 days later telling me she hoped I'd understand that she just wasn't built for the life this was going to become." His voice had gone flat, the practiced flatness Claire recognized now as the sound of an old wound worn smooth by years of being touched. "I spent a long time telling myself it was the wheelchair, that I'd become something she couldn't love anymore, something that needed too much cost, asked too much of a person who'd only ever signed up for the easy version of me." And now Claire asked softly, "Now I don't know what I believe," he admitted. "Some nights I still think it. Some nights I think the money and the name were always the only things anyone really wanted from me in the first place, and the chair just gave people permission to stop pretending otherwise. He looked up at her then, and the rawness in his eyes was almost more than Claire could bear to witness the specific, terrible vulnerability of a man who had spent 6 years convincing himself he no longer needed anyone to see this particular wound, only to find it laid bare unbidden in front of the one person he'd least expected to still be sitting across the table from him when it happened. I stopped believing anyone could want the whole of me after that, he said, quieter now, almost a confession. Just the name, or the pity. Never both halves at once, the man and the chair, the fortune and the fear, the whole ugly, complicated truth of what's left of me. He exhaled, unsteady. I married you on a curb outside a gas station because for one strange, reckless night, it didn't feel like it mattered whether you wanted the whole of me or not. We were both just two people who'd been thrown away holding on to the nearest thing that felt solid. But it's been weeks now, Claire, and I find myself terrified every single day that I'm going to wake up and you'll have realized exactly what Delilah realized. That the version of me sitting in this chair simply isn't worth staying for. For a long moment, Claire didn't answer him with words at all. She reached across the small kitchen table instead, the same gesture she'd offered him days before, over cold coffee and buried foundation records, and covered his folded hands with both of hers, not gently this time, but firmly, the grip of someone determined to be believed. I am not going anywhere, she said, and there was no softness left in her voice, only conviction hard and clear as struck glass. Not because of a courthouse and a piece of paper, not because your name turned out to be attached to more money than I've ever seen in my life. I am staying because 3 weeks ago, in the middle of the worst night of my life, you were the only person in 100 miles who looked at me like I was still worth something, and I have spent every single day since then, watching you be exactly that same kind of person to everyone around you, whether they ever notice it or not. Her voice caught just slightly before she steadied it again. You are not a burden that requires the right kind of woman to tolerate you, Wyatt. You are the first home I have ever been offered that didn't come with a price tag attached to my worth. Wyatt sat very still, something enormous and long-held finally giving way behind his ribs, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rough in an entirely different way than before. I don't know how to trust that, he admitted. Not yet. I want to. God, I want to more than I've wanted anything in 6 years. But some part of me is always going to be bracing for the moment it turns out to be conditional after all. Then let me prove it wrong, Claire said simply, one ordinary day at a time. I'm not asking you to trust it all at once. I'm asking you to let me stay long enough to show you. Neither of them moved to leave the table for a long while after that. The old kitchen clock ticked forward. The refrigerator hummed its familiar note in the next room, and somewhere in the space between one breath and the next, something in Wyatt Calloway that had been braced and guarded for 6 straight years, finally, carefully began to unclench. Not fully, not all at once, but enough that when Claire finally rose to help him to bed, he let her rest a hand against his shoulder the entire way down the hall, and did not once flinch from it. He fell asleep that night for the first time since the wedding before the nightmares had the chance to find him. A few weeks later, the offices of Calloway Stringworks occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown, all exposed brick and reclaimed oak beams, the scent of sawdust drifting up faintly from the manufacturing floor below, even into the executive suites, a deliberate, design choice Wyatt had insisted years ago, so that no one working above ever forgot what the company actually made or why it mattered. Leo Danvers had worked in those offices for going on 9 years, long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things Calloway Stringworks chairman asked of him. He had drafted contracts in the middle of the night, flown to Memphis on 2 hours' notice, once spent an entire Christmas Eve untangling a supply dispute with a lumber cooperative in East Tennessee, so that 300 employees would still have jobs in January. He considered himself by any reasonable measure unshockable. The message that came through his encrypted line a little after 10 o'clock on a Thursday night tested that assumption considerably. Terminate all active contracts with Sutton Development effective immediately. Full portfolio, the Belmead Retail. Build out the warehouse lease on 2nd Avenue. All 11 agreements. Route the paperwork through legal first thing tomorrow. And reach out to First Cumberland and Bellwood Trust quietly. I want to know exactly how exposed Sutton Development's credit position is by end of week. Leo read the message twice, then picked up his phone and called the number few people outside the company's innermost circle had ever been given. Sir, he said carefully when Wyatt answered on the second ring, the sound of a television murmuring faintly somewhere behind him, the small, ordinary domestic noise of a man Leo had never once in 9 years heard raise his voice. 11 contracts is not a small position to unwind overnight. Sutton Development supplies retail space for 3 of our regional stores. This is going to be visible. People are going to ask why. Let them ask, Wyatt said, and something in his tone, flat, deliberate, entirely unlike the careful, measured chairman Leo had come to know, made Leo sit up a little straighter in his chair. Richard Sutton disowned his own daughter in front of 300 people 3 weeks ago and stripped her down to bare feet on a gravel driveway. I am not interested in doing further business with a man who treats his own blood that way. Leo hesitated, weighing the professional instinct to push back against 9 years of trusting his employer's judgment, even when the reasoning behind it stayed private. In the end, trust won out the way it usually did. I'll have the termination letters drafted by morning, he said. May I ask, is this personal, sir? There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Leo wondered if the call had dropped. It's the most personal thing I've done in 6 years, Wyatt said finally, and hung up before Leo could ask anything further. By the following evening, the 11 termination letters had gone out under the letterhead of Calloway Stringworks Holding Company, each one carrying the same unadorned signature block that had for 6 years given no name at all, only the title chairman's office and a company seal that meant to anyone in Nashville's business circles who'd tried and failed to identify the man behind it precisely nothing and everything at once. First, Cumberland Bank. Following a quiet inquiry from a firm whose business it could not afford to lose, began a discreet internal review of the Sutton Development credit line the same week. Richard Sutton found out on a Friday morning, standing in his own kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, while his chief financial officer read the termination notices aloud over speakerphone in a voice that kept catching on, in numbers too large to fully process. 11, Richard said, when the CFO finally stopped talking. 11 contracts do not evaporate overnight. Who signed this? The letters all carry the same authority, sir, the CFO said. Chairman's office. Calloway Holding Entity. I've made 3 calls trying to reach anyone who can explain the reasoning, and I keep hitting the same wall everyone in this city hits. Nobody has ever actually seen this chairman. 6 years and the man is a rumor that signs documents. And the banks? A pause worse than silence. First, Cumberland is reviewing our credit line as of this morning. If they follow Calloway's lead, sir, we could be looking at a freeze on almost everything. Barbara Sutton appeared in the kitchen doorway, then, still in her robe, drawn by the particular stillness of her husband's posture, the stillness of a man watching something enormous and unstoppable bear down on him from a distance he hadn't accounted for. What is it? She said. Not a question exactly, more a demand that reality reveal itself as something manageable. Someone is destroying us, Richard said quietly. And I don't know who or why or how to make it stop. It was Madison who put the pieces together 3 days later, curled on the edge of her mother's bed, with a magazine she wasn't reading, turning the problem over the way she turned over most problems, as an equation to be solved, rather than a consequence to be reckoned with. A ghost can't be fought, she said slowly, but a family can be charmed. She looked up, something calculating sharpening behind her eyes. The Calloways are hosting their grandmother's annual gala next month at Belle Meade. Old Nashville money. The kind that still cares about appearances more than anything else. If I can get us an invitation, and I can through the Whitfields, they owe Daddy a favor, then whoever this chairman is, he still answers to a family name. Every rich man does, eventually. We charm the grandmother. We find our way to whoever's actually pulling the strings. Barbara's face, for the first time in days, showed something close to relief. And your sister, she asked. Word is she married some cripple relation of theirs. Some charity case they keep tucked out of sight. Madison's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Even better, Mother, she said. Then the trash has delivered itself straight to the venue. Whatever misfortune came for us, it started the night she walked out of that tent. If there's a way back in, she's the door. Neither of them had any idea, sitting in that quiet bedroom weighing strategies against a faceless enemy, that the door they were so carefully plotting to walk through belonged to the very man whose empire they were currently watching dismantle their own. That the ghost chairman whose signature had frozen their credit lines and terminated their contracts was at that exact moment sitting in a modest kitchen on the east side of town, watching his new wife hum quietly to herself while she reheated leftovers on a stovetop that had never once in all its years of service cooked a meal that cost more than $20. Wyatt Calloway had built an empire out of the wreckage of a childhood defined by scarcity, and in 6 years of running it from behind a name no one outside his innermost circle had ever learned to attach to a face he had never once used. That power the way he'd used it this week. Not for leverage, not for profit, but simply because a man had humiliated his own daughter in public and Wyatt, who remembered exactly what it felt like to be discarded by the people meant to protect him, found that some debts, once he had the power to collect them, were no longer debts he was willing to let go unpaid. He did not yet know that a gala invitation was already being drafted, 3 counties away, addressed not to him but to the family he'd married into, nor that the woman washing dishes quietly behind him, humming an old tune under her breath, without realizing it was the opening bars of a piece she'd composed at 9 years old and never finished, was about to walk unknowingly straight back into the lion's den. Her own mother was so carefully preparing to open. The manufacturing floor of Calloway Stringworks occupied the ground level of the old warehouse, a long sunshot room where the smell of rosewood shavings and lacquer hung permanently in the air, where the whine of a band saw, and the low murmur of men and women bent over half-finished guitar, necks created its own particular kind of music. Sam Riley had worked that floor for 15 years longer than almost anyone still employed there, and had run it as shop foreman for the last 8. A broad-shouldered man in his 40s with sawdust, permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles, and the specific, unhurried authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect the floor gave him rather than inherited it. He had also known Wyatt Calloway since they were 9 years old, back when Wyatt's father still ran the business out of a single room behind a feed store, and Sam's own family lived 2 trailers down from theirs on the same gravel. A lot 2 boys who'd grown up sharing the particular hunger and the particular pride of families who had nothing, and refused to act like it defined them. Sam had been there for the funeral when Wyatt's father died. He had been there in the hospital hallway for 6 straight weeks after the accident, sleeping some nights in a plastic chair rather than go home. If there was one person on earth who had earned the right to walk into the chairman's office unannounced, it was Sam Riley, and he exercised that right without hesitation on a gray Tuesday afternoon. A set of blueprints for a new production line rolled under one arm, ostensibly the reason for the Bausenik visit. He set the blueprints down on Wyatt's desk without unrolling them. "You married her," he said. "Not a question." Wyatt didn't look up from the report he'd been reading. "I did. 3 weeks after meeting her. The same day her fiancé got arrested for wire fraud. The same night her own father disowned her in front of half of Nashville's society pages." Sam crossed his arms, leaning back against the doorframe, his voice carrying none of the anger Wyatt might have braced for, and all the harder, more painful weight of genuine worry. "I've known you since we were splitting a single winter coat between the 2 of us, Wyatt. I watched what Delilah did to you. I watched you rebuild yourself into somebody who doesn't let anybody close enough to do that again, and I have spent 6 years being grateful you finally figured out how to protect your own heart. And now you're telling me you handed the whole thing over to a woman you'd known for exactly 1 evening." Wyatt finally set the report down, something tightening at the corner of his jaw. "That's not what happened." "Isn't it?" Sam's voice stayed level, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. "I did some digging because that's what I do when I care about somebody. I checked. Her family's business just got frozen out of 3 banks the same week she married into a fortune she had no idea existed. You don't think that's worth a second look? You don't think it's at least possible she's smarter than she's letting on, and knew exactly what kind of man was sitting under that oak tree before she ever opened her mouth?" "She didn't know who I was," Wyatt said, quiet but firm. "She still doesn't fully understand the scope of it. I've watched her flinch every time I've mentioned a number over $100, Sam. That's not a woman running a con, or it's a very good one." Sam pushed off the doorframe, crossing the room to stand closer, his voice dropping into something almost pleading, now the careful, exhausted tone of a man who has said hard things to a friend before and knows the cost of saying them again. "I'm not trying to hurt you. God knows that's the last thing I want. But I have watched you get burned exactly once by somebody who let you believe you were loved for the whole of yourself. And I watched what that fire did to you long after the physical scars had already healed. I am not willing to stand by quietly and watch it happen twice." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, something conflicted and raw moving behind his eyes. Not anger at Sam, not exactly, but the particular ache of hearing an old wound named out loud by the one person who'd actually witnessed it happen. First time. Some part of him, he had to admit, in the deep, small hours when sleep wouldn't come, had entertained the same fear on his own. He had told Claire as much weeks ago at the kitchen table in the middle of the night. He had not expected to hear it echoed back at him quite this bluntly in daylight, by the one man alive whose loyalty he had never once had reason to doubt. "I hear you," Wyatt said finally, and meant it. "I do, and I'm not going to pretend the thought hasn't crossed my mind, because it has more than once. But I need you to trust me on this one, Sam, the way I've trusted you on every decision you've ever made about this company without asking you to justify it to me first. This isn't the company, Sam said. This is your life. It's both, Wyatt admitted. It's always been both for me. But I need you to understand something. I've spent 6 years letting the fear of being wrong about someone keep me from ever being right about anyone at all. I built a wall so high and so thick that I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting myself and simply being alone. Claire is the first thing that's happened to me since the accident that made me willing to risk being wrong again. His voice caught, just slightly before he steadied it. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, and it'll hurt, and I'll survive it the way I've survived everything else. But I am done letting one woman's cruelty 6 years ago dictate the shape of every relationship I have for the rest of my life. Sam studied him for a long moment, something in his own hard expression, finally softening at the edges. Not agreement, not yet, but the particular loosening of a man who has said everything he came to say, and now has to decide whether loyalty means continuing to push or stepping back to let his friend find his own way through it. I'm going to keep watching, Sam said finally. Not because I don't trust you, because I love you like a brother, and I'm not going to sit on my hands if I see something that worries me. That's not a threat, Wyatt. That's a promise. I wouldn't want it any other way, Wyatt said, and something eased between them, old friendship finding its footing again, even with the disagreement still unresolved underneath it. Sam left the office a few minutes later, rolling up the blueprints he'd never actually needed to bring, and Wyatt sat alone at his desk for a long while afterward, turning the conversation over in his mind with more unease than he'd let show. It wasn't that Sam's warning had planted doubt where none existed before, it was that some small wounded part of him, the same part that had watched Delilah's moving truck pull away 6 years ago, recognized the shape of fear immediately, and knew exactly how easily it could take root if he let it. That evening, driving home through the early dark, he found himself watching Claire more closely than usual as she stood at the stove, humming that same half-remembered tune she always hummed without seeming to notice she was doing it, watching for some flicker of calculation, some crack in the plain, unguarded warmth she'd shown him since the night at the gas station curb. He found nothing, only Claire, tired from a long day, asking without looking up whether he wanted the cornbread from the pan or the skillet, entirely unaware that somewhere across town, her own sister was already 3 phone calls deep into securing an invitation to a gala. Neither of them had any idea would bring every buried truth in both their families crashing down at once. A week later, a black sedan pulled up outside the duplex on a Sunday afternoon, gleaming and entirely out of place against the honeysuckle fence and the laundromat's flickering sign, and Claire watched from the kitchen window as a woman emerged from the back seat with the particular unhurried grace of someone who had never once in her life doubted that a room would rearrange itself around her arrival. Wyatt Calloway did not knock. She simply stood on the small front porch until Odessa, alerted by the sound of car doors, opened the door herself. And even then, Eleanor's gaze moved past the older woman, entirely sweeping the modest living room with an expression Claire recognized instantly, the same expression her own mother had worn at 100 dinner parties, the look of someone cataloging a room's shortcomings before she'd even finished crossing its threshold. "So this is where my son has been hiding," Eleanor said, stepping past Odessa without invitation. "I'd heard the address. I confess I didn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes." Wyatt appeared in the hallway, and something in his posture shifted the moment he saw her, not surprise exactly, but the particular bracing of a man readying himself for a blow he'd felt coming for weeks. "Mother," he said, carefully neutral. "You didn't call ahead." "Should I have to call ahead to see my own son?" Eleanor's eyes moved to Claire, then taking her in from bare feet to unstyled hair with a slow, deliberate thoroughness that made Claire feel for one dizzying moment exactly as small and disposable as she'd felt on the gravel outside Sweetbriar Hall weeks before. "Or is this the arrangement I should have been warned about first?" "This is Claire," Wyatt said. "My wife." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I've heard. The market gossip, the disowned Sutton girl. Tell me, does she know the Calloway name has stood in this state for 4 generations, that governors return this family's calls, and my son crowns 6 years of quiet disgrace by dragging a penniless stranger off the street into it?" The words landed exactly where they were aimed, precise and cold, and Claire felt heat rise in her face, not shame. She realized a beat later, but something closer to fury, sharp and sudden and entirely unfamiliar in its intensity. She thought of the gravel outside the tent. She thought of her father's voice cracking across 300 guests. She had promised herself in the wreckage of that night that she would never again stand quietly while someone decided her worth for her. "With respect, ma'am," Claire said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You may say whatever you like about me, I've been insulted by people who fed and clothed me for years, so I've built up something of a tolerance for it. But you will not stand in your son's house and call him a disgrace." She held Eleanor's gaze, refusing to look away first. "This man, and the family you settled with a monthly allowance and hid 3 counties away like an old debt you were embarrassed to keep paying. He is worth more than every name-dropping mouth in Nashville society combined. You threw him away when he needed you most. You lost the right to be ashamed of him the day you did that." For one long suspended moment, the room held perfectly still. Odessa, standing near the kitchen doorway, pressed a hand briefly to her own chest, as though she'd witnessed something she'd waited a long time to see happen. Eleanor's composure didn't crack. Women like Eleanor Calloway had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of never letting a room see them shaken, but something flickered behind her eyes, quick and gone, that might have been surprise or something closer to recognition. "She has a mouth," Eleanor said finally, to no one in particular. "She has a spine," Mother Wyatt said quietly, and there was something in his voice Claire hadn't heard from him before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of hard, tired clarity. The sound of a man finally saying a thing he'd swallowed for years. "It runs in her family. Apparently it skipped ours." Eleanor's jaw tightened, the only visible crack in her composure. "This is not finished," she said, gathering herself, moving back toward the door with the same unhurried grace she'd arrived with. "The family will hear about this marriage. All of it." She paused in the doorway, looking back once, her gaze settling not on Claire this time but on Wyatt, something almost vulnerable passing across her face before it hardened again into something colder. "You were always going to find a way to punish me for the accident, Wyatt. I understand that. I simply hoped it wouldn't look quite like this." She was gone before he could answer, the black sedan pulling away down the narrow street, and the small house settled back into a silence that felt for a long moment entirely too loud. That evening, after Odessa had gone home and the dishes had been washed in a silence neither of them quite knew how to break, Wyatt found himself standing at the front window, watching the empty street where his mother's car had disappeared. An hour before, something coiled and unresolved sitting heavy behind his ribs. "I'm sorry," he said finally, not turning around. "For what she said to you. You don't owe me an apology for someone else's cruelty," Claire said, coming to stand beside him. "I've had a lifetime of practice absorbing it. I'll survive hers too. That's not the part I'm sorry for." Wyatt's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone tight in a way Claire hadn't heard since the night at the kitchen table weeks before. "Sam's already warned me you might be after the name or the money. Now my own mother's standing in my living room implying the same thing in different words. I keep telling myself I don't believe either of them. And then some small, ugly part of me hears it anyway. And I hate that it's still in there after everything you've shown me." Claire turned to face him fully, something steady and unflinching in her expression. "Then don't let it win," she said simply. "I can't fight a fear that lives inside your own head, Wyatt. I can only keep showing up the same way I have every day since the curb. But you're going to have to decide at some point whether you're going to let 6 years of other people's cruelty keep writing the story of what we are." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, something raw and unresolved moving behind his eyes. And then, in a decision he would come to regret within days, not out of malice, but out of the particular wounded instinct of a man trying to protect the one good thing in his life by controlling the terms of it rather than trusting it, he said the words before he'd fully thought them through. "I want the doors locked when I'm not here," he said. "Both of them. I don't want you going anywhere without me knowing exactly where and why." Claire stared at him, something in her expression shifting from confusion to a slow dawning hurt. "Wyatt, you don't mean that." "I do," he said, and hated the sound of his own voice. Even as he said it, hated the echo of his mother's controlling grip on his own life, now reaching, however unconsciously, into hers. "I can't lose the one thing that's made any of this bearable, Claire. Not to my mother's suspicion, not to Sam's warnings, not to some man from your old life deciding to come collect on a debt I can't even see coming. I need to know you're safe. I need to know where you are." "That's not safety," Claire said quietly, something cold settling into her voice for the first time since she'd married him. "That's a cage with better furniture in it. I have spent my whole life being controlled by people who called it protection, Wyatt. My father called it protection when he hid me in the country for 16 years so my sister could have Nashville to herself. I did not marry a stranger off a curb to trade one locked door for another." She left the room before he could answer, and Wyatt sat alone in the fading evening light, the echo of his mother's visit and his own frightened, controlling words tangled together in his chest. understanding too late the way understanding so often arrives that in trying to protect the fragile new thing between them, he had just cracked it himself with his own 2 hands in almost exactly the shape of every wound that had put it there in the first place. The following week, Claire sat in a small examination room at the Vanderbilt outpatient clinic, not as a patient herself, but as the anxious, attentive wife of one watching doctor. Patricia Wells review a stack of Wyatt's most recent scans with the particular unhurried care of a physician who had learned over decades that difficult news delivered too quickly often failed to land at all. The tension between Claire and Wyatt in the days since his mother's visit had not fully broken, though it had softened into something more like wary tenderness, an unspoken agreement to keep trying, even as the locked doors remained locked, even as neither of them had quite found the words to fully repair what his fear had cracked. Claire had come to this appointment alone at Wyatt's insistence because his own schedule had collided with a supplier meeting he couldn't move, and because some quiet growing worry in her had made her want to hear the truth from a doctor without the buffer of Wyatt's own carefully composed calm standing between her and it. "I want to be honest with you about something," Dr. Wells said, finally setting the file down, her expression gentle but direct. "Your husband's nerve pain, the kind that comes from burns this deep and scarring this extensive, doesn't fully go away. Not with medication, not with time. Some nights it will be manageable. Other nights it won't be, and I suspect from what little he's told me, and rather more, that he hasn't, that those nights have been happening more often than he's let either of us know." Claire's stomach tightened. "What does that mean? What does he do on those nights?" Dr. Wells hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. Patients carrying this kind of long-term, unrelenting pain, especially patients who've also carried it in isolation for years, sometimes develop a very dangerous coping pattern. When the nerve pain becomes unbearable, some of them create a different pain, a controllable one, specifically to drown the first out. A cut, a burn on top of an old burn. Something they can manage when the pain that's actually hurting them feels like it can't be managed at all. She met Claire's eyes, steady and grave. "If you ever find marks on him you can't explain, or a locked door and unusual silence behind it, do not assume it's simply modesty or a bad night. He wants to sleep off alone. Please, do not leave him by himself when that happens." Claire left the clinic that afternoon with her chest tight and her mind racing, the words "locked door" landing with a particular terrible irony given the argument still simmering unresolved at home. She spent the rest of the day at the clinic anyway, unable to simply go home and sit with what she'd learned, instead sitting through 2 full training sessions with a physical therapist, absorbing everything she could about deep tissue, work scar band mobility, breathing techniques for acute nerve flares, filling a spiral notebook with notes in handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady the longer the day went on. She told no one where she was. She simply stayed 12 full hours learning with a kind of desperate, silent devotion how to fight a war. She'd only just learned her husband had been fighting alone for 6 years. She did not know that Sam Riley, at Wyatt's own anxious request, had spent that same afternoon following her at a careful distance. Wyatt had not asked out of malice, and he would spend a long time afterward regretting that he'd asked at all. It had come from fear, the same wounded, controlling fear that had made him demand locked doors days earlier, sharpened now by 12 unexplained hours and a silent phone, and the ghost of a moving truck outside an apartment building 6 years. Gone. He had called Sam that morning, voice tight, and asked him without quite being able to name why, to make sure Claire was safe. Sam, still carrying his own unresolved worry, had agreed, before either of them had fully examined what the request actually was. Sam found her a little after 2 in the afternoon in the clinic's public waiting room, and what he witnessed there would stay with him for the rest of his life. Claire was not shopping. She was not meeting anyone in secret, was not on the phone with an old fiancé or a bank arranging some quiet betrayal. She was sitting beside an elderly man in a threadbare cardigan, a stranger someone Sam later learned was a widower named Harold, who came to the clinic 3 times a week for treatments no family member had ever once accompanied him to. Claire had simply noticed him sitting alone, noticed the particular loneliness of an old man facing a needle with no hand to hold, and had crossed the waiting room to sit beside him, had held his hand through an infusion that clearly frightened him, had made him laugh once quietly at something Sam was too far away to hear, had stayed with him a full hour after her own appointments ended simply because no one else was going to. Sam sat in his car in the clinic parking lot afterward for a long time before he could bring himself to drive home, something hard and defensive in him finally completely giving way. He had spent weeks building a case in his own mind, A woman who'd appeared too conveniently at exactly the moment his oldest friend was most vulnerable, whose family's fortunes had shifted the very week she married into one. He had watched that afternoon for evidence of exactly the kind of calculation he'd warned Wyatt about. What he'd found instead was a woman who gave away an hour of her own limited freedom to a stranger who had nothing whatsoever to offer her. In return, not money, not connections, not even the ordinary social currency of being seen doing a kind thing, since she'd had no idea anyone was watching at all. He called Wyatt that night, his voice rough, in a way Wyatt had rarely heard from him. "I owe you an apology," Sam said without preamble. "And I owe her a bigger one, though I don't know yet how I'm going to give it to her without confessing I was following her in the first place." "What did you see?" Wyatt asked, something cautious and hopeful tangled together in his voice. Sam told him the old man, the infusion, the hour given away to a stranger with nothing to give back. And by the time he finished, something in Wyatt's chest had loosened so completely, he had to sit down at the kitchen table simply to hold the weight of it. "I was wrong," Sam said. "I was so sure I was protecting you, and instead I spent weeks making you doubt the one good thing that's happened to you in 6 years. I'm sorry, Wyatt. I mean that. You were protecting me the only way you knew how," Wyatt said quietly. "I can't be angry at you for that. I was doing the exact same thing in a worse way when I told her I wanted the doors locked." There was a pause on the line, and when Sam spoke again, his voice had steadied into something firmer, more resolved. "Whatever you need from me going forward." Wyatt, watching her, defending her, standing between her and anyone who tries to hurt her the way your mother did in that living room I'm in. "Completely. She earned that today, whether she ever finds out I was the one who saw it happen." Neither of them yet knew that on the far side of town, in a cramped apartment above a downtown bar, Brett Sanders, 3 weeks unemployed, drowning in legal fees from his own fraud, charges desperate in the particular dangerous way of a man who has run out of respectable options, had spent that same afternoon staring at a hospital billing statement he'd obtained through a contact who owed him a favor, a statement bearing a name and an account number that led, after several hours of increasingly frantic searching, to a truth that made his hands shake with something between fury and opportunity. The quiet, wheelchair-bound stranger Claire Sutton had married on a whim was not simply some charity case living above a laundromat. He was worth, by Brett's rough calculations, somewhere north of $400 million. And Brett Sanders, staring at that number in the dim light of his apartment, understood immediately that he had just found the single most valuable piece of information he would ever hold in his life, and that Barbara Sutton, desperate and drowning under the weight of 11 terminated contracts, would pay almost anything to have it. Brett Sanders did not go directly to Barbara Sutton. He was reckless, not stupid, and 3 weeks of watching his own legal fees pile up faster than his unemployment checks could cover had taught him the value of patience he hadn't possessed a month earlier. He spent 2 days confirming what the billing statement suggested, cross-referencing property records, digging through old business filings until the shape of it became unmistakable. The quiet man in the wheelchair who'd married Claire Sutton on a whim outside a gas station was in fact the reclusive chairman of Calloway Stringworks, the same ghost whose signature had frozen the Suttons' credit lines and gutted their business inside of a single week. He met Barbara at a coffee shop 2 counties over somewhere. Neither of them was likely to be recognized, and slid a folded printout across the table without preamble. "Your daughter didn't marry a charity case," he said. "She married the man who's been quietly bankrupting your family for weeks. I don't know if that makes this better or worse for you, but I imagine it's worth something." Barbara read the printout twice, her face draining of color and then flushing hot with something between fury and calculation. "How much do you want?" she said, not a question. "Enough to make my legal problems disappear," Brett said. "And enough to start over somewhere nobody in Nashville has ever heard my name." Barbara did not pay him herself. She was, whatever else her failures as a mother, had been careful enough to know that this particular piece of information belonged in more capable hands than her own, and so 3 days later she arranged a meeting Brett would remember for the rest of his life in a private dining room at a club he'd never have been able to afford entry to on his own. Across the table from a silver-haired man, in an impeccable suit, who introduced himself only as Russell Calloway. "My nephew has spent 6 years being very careful about who learns his real identity," Russell said once Brett had laid out everything he knew. "I confess I'm curious how a man in your position managed to find it before I did, given that I've been looking in one fashion or another for most of those 6 years myself." "I got lucky," Brett said. "And desperate. A combustible combination." Russell studied him for a long moment, something cold and appraising in his gaze. "Let me be candid with you, Mr. Sanders, since candor seems to be the currency of this particular evening. My nephew controls 61% of Calloway Stringworks through a trust our family set up decades ago, back when the company was worth considerably less than it is today. I have spent 6 years trying through entirely legal means to have that trust restructured to argue, gently and repeatedly to a board that has never once taken me seriously, that a man in his condition might benefit from stepping back and allowing more capable hands to steer the company forward. I have made very little progress. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, a piece of information suggesting his new marriage was entered into under false pretenses. However, a gold-digging bride from a disgraced family secured within hours of meeting him, timed suspiciously close to his sudden and rather public retaliation against her own father's business that might prove considerably more persuasive to a board already nervous about his judgment. Brett understood slowly, and with a chill he hadn't expected to feel, that he had just handed a weapon to a man far more dangerous than Barbara Sutton had ever been, a man who had been waiting patiently for 6 years for exactly this kind of opening. What happened to him? Brett asked, unable to stop himself. 6 years ago, the accident. Something flickered behind Russell's eyes, gone almost before it registered. A tragedy, he said smoothly. Cars fail, even good ones. He slid an envelope across the table, thick and final. I trust this settles our business, Mr. Sanders. I'd advise you to spend it somewhere considerably farther from Nashville than you're currently planning. Brett left the club that night with more money than he'd seen in one place in his life, and a growing uneasy certainty that he had just made himself complicit in something he didn't fully understand and would very much regret understanding later. Meanwhile, Sam Riley had spent the days since the clinic parking lot trying to find the right way to make amends, not just to Wyatt, whose forgiveness had come easily, but to Claire, whose trust he'd never actually earned in the first place, having spent weeks treating her like a suspect rather than a sister-in-law. He found her on a Saturday morning in the small backyard of the duplex, kneeling in a patch of dirt beside the fence, attempting with more determination than skill to coax a stubborn tomato plant into standing upright against a leaning stake. "You're doing that wrong," Sam said by way of greeting, and Claire looked up, startled, wary, in a way that told him plainly she remembered every unkind glance he'd given her over the past month. "I'm aware," she said. "The plant and I have an understanding. It resents me, and I resent it back." Sam knelt down beside her without being asked, taking the stake from her hands and driving it into the soil at a better angle with the easy competence of a man who'd grown up gardening out of necessity rather than hobby. "I owe you an apology," he said, not looking up from the work. "A real one. Not the kind where I explain all the reasons I thought I was justified, because I wasn't. Not really. I spent a month deciding you were dangerous before I ever gave you the chance to prove otherwise. And that wasn't fair to you." Claire was quiet for a moment, watching him work. "What changed?" "I watched you," Sam admitted, and told her haltingly about the clinic, the old man, the hour she'd given away to a stranger, without any idea she'd been seen at all. "I've known Wyatt since we were 9 years old, sharing a coat in the winter because neither of our families could afford to. I have watched exactly one person break his heart before, and I swore to myself I'd see it coming the second time. I was so busy watching for the wrong kind of woman that I almost missed the right one standing directly in front of me." Claire's eyes stung, unexpected and sudden. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "And thank you for caring about him enough to be suspicious in the first place. I'd rather have a friend who's careful with him than one who lets anybody walk through the door." "For what it's worth," Sam said, tying off the tomato stake and sitting back on his heels, "you've got my loyalty now. All of it. If anybody ever comes after you the way this town's been trying to come after Wyatt for years, they'll have to get through me first." Neither of them could have known, kneeling in that small garden in the honest light of a Saturday morning, that the promise would be tested far sooner than either expected, that an envelope of information had already changed hands. Too, the counties over that Russell Calloway was at that very moment drafting a quiet letter to the Calloway Stringworks board, raising gentle, poisonous questions about his nephew's judgment, and that a hand-delivered invitation to Vivian Calloway's annual gala was already sitting sealed and waiting on a silver tray in Belle Mead, addressed not only to Wyatt and his new bride, but through a favor owed to the Whitfield family to the entire disgraced Sutton household as well. The letter arrived at the duplex on a Tuesday afternoon, hand-delivered by a driver in a gray suit who waited on the porch until Odessa signed for it, as though the envelope itself were too important to be left unattended even for the length of a doorbell's ring. Claire turned it over in her hands, heavy cream stock, the Calloway family crest embossed at its center, and felt something tighten low in her stomach before she'd even broken the seal. "My grandson has avoided this house for 6 years, and I have allowed it out of a grandmother's foolish patience," the letter, read in handwriting that slanted with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her life doubted she would be obeyed. That patience has run its course. Bring your wife to the gala at Belmead, Wyatt, or I will come to that little house myself and sit on your porch until the neighbors start asking questions worth asking. V.C. Wyatt read it twice, and something that was almost a laugh escaped him dry and startled. That's Grandma Vivian, he said, handing the letter to Claire. She means every word of that threat, and she'd enjoy every second of carrying it out. You've avoided her for 6 years, Claire asked. She's the one member of my family who never once agreed with how the rest of them handled things after the accident. Wyatt said something complicated moving across his face, which somehow made it harder to face her, not easier. It's difficult to sit across from the one person who might have fought for you and explain why you let everyone else win instead. A week later in the Sutton household, an entirely different letter arrived, secured. Though Barbara didn't yet know it through a favor, the Whitfield family owed Richard from decades earlier, a connection Madison had spent 3 careful phone calls cultivating into an actual invitation. Madison held the cream envelope up to the kitchen light, like a woman examining a winning lottery ticket. We're in, she said. Vivian Calloway's gala. Old Nashville money, the kind that still decides who matters in this city and who doesn't. Her eyes glittered with the particular sharpness of a woman who had spent weeks watching her family's fortunes collapse, and finally saw a path back out. I'm performing. I've already spoken to the events coordinator, a piece on the classical guitar, something that'll remind everyone in that room exactly what real talent looks like. And your sister Barbara asked, something venomous creeping into her voice. I hear she'll be there too. Playing house with the man who's been quietly ruining us for a month. Even better, Madison said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Let her watch me remind everyone who the real Sutton is. Belmead on the night of the gala glittered the way. Old Nashville money always glittered. String lights strung between ancient oaks, a jazz quartet playing something warm and unhurried on the terrace, the low murmur of several hundred, conversations conducted in the particular hushed confidence of people who had never once had to worry about the cost of anything in the room. Claire stood at the edge of it in a simple, elegant navy dress. Vivian's own stylist had sent over that morning with a note that read only, "You will not walk into my house looking like you don't belong there, child. Wear this," and felt for the first time since the wedding something like solid ground beneath her feet. Wyatt beside her had dressed with more formality than she'd yet seen from him, his usual quiet reserve sharpened into something closer to armor. Stay close, he said, not as a command this time, but as a confession. I don't do well in rooms like this without someone I trust nearby. I'm not going anywhere, Claire said, and meant it in every sense the words could carry. They found Richard and Barbara Sutton within the first 20 minutes cornered near the terrace bar, both of them visibly diminished from the last time Claire had seen them. The particular deflation of people who had spent weeks watching an empire they'd taken for granted come apart in slow motion. Barbara reached Claire first, her hand closing around her daughter's wrist with a desperation that had nothing to do with affection. Whatever's happened between us, Barbara said low and urgent, you are still my daughter. Family is family, Claire. Please, talk to your husband. Ask him to lift the freeze on our accounts. A word from you could save this family. Claire looked at her mother's hand on her wrist, and something in her, some last quiet hope that had survived even the wreckage of the wedding, finally fully let go. Family, Claire repeated very evenly. That word only ever visits your mouth when you need something from me. You disowned me in front of 300 people, Mother. You had them take my shoes off my feet on a gravel driveway. And now you're standing in a ballroom asking me to go beg a man you called a cripple relation for money. She removed her mother's hand gently but firmly from her wrist. I watched both of you let me drown for 26 years. You taught me exactly how that's done. I'm not doing it again for you or for anyone. She walked away before Barbara could answer, and made it perhaps 30 feet before Brett Sanders intercepted her near the garden entrance, a drink already in his hand. His tie loosened in a way that suggested it was not his first of the evening. You look good, he said, an ugly familiar smile spreading across his face. Rich looks good on you. Funny how that works. He leaned closer, dropping his voice. Here's my offer. Since I've clearly still got some love left for you underneath everything. These Calloways have money buried everywhere. Even the broken one has to have something he'd sign over quietly if the right woman asked nicely enough. Get me a settlement. Anything. And I'll take you back, Claire. The two of us. The way it was supposed to be before I made one stupid mistake. Claire looked at him for a long moment and felt nothing at all. No anger, no old ache. Nothing but a vast, clean absence where 6 years of loving him used to live. The man you're calling broken, she said quietly, has more spine sitting in that chair than you've ever managed standing on your own 2 feet. If you ever speak his name again, Brett, or come near either of us, you will find out exactly how far his patience does not extend. She walked past him without waiting for a response, her heart pounding, but her hands, she noticed with some distant surprise, entirely steady. It was Wyatt Calloway who found her a few minutes later near the edge of the terrace, and the older woman's sharp eyes softened the moment she took Claire in properly for the first time. So you're the girl who knelt in front of a wheelchair outside a gas station in front of God, and everybody. Wyatt said, something warm threading beneath her formidable exterior. They tell me you didn't know a single thing about his family or his fortune when you did it. I knew he looked at me like I was still worth something, Claire said. That was all I needed to know. Wyatt studied her for a long, searching moment, and then reached up and unclasped something from around her own neck, an old ring on a delicate chain, gold gone soft with age, clearly older than anything else in the room. This ring has entered this family for 4 generations, she said, sliding it free and pressing it into Claire's palm. It goes to the wife with the strongest hand. My grandson has spent 6 years hiding from people who never deserved the chance to know him. I have a feeling you're about to make sure the rest of this city finds out exactly what they've been missing. Across the terrace near the small stage where the evening's entertainment was being arranged, Madison Sutton adjusted the strings of a classical guitar with practiced, elegant hands, entirely unaware that the piece she was about to perform one. She had spent months privately rehearsing one. She intended to present tonight as her own original composition before this exact room full of people who mattered most, belonged note for note to the sister she'd just watched walk away from their mother without a single backward glance. The event's coordinator's voice carried warm and clear over the terrace speakers, drawing the scattered conversations of several hundred guests toward the small raised stage at the garden's edge. Ladies and gentlemen, in honor of our hostess this evening, a special performance on classical guitar, an original composition, we're told, from Miss Madison Sutton. A ripple of polite applause moved through the crowd as Madison settled onto the stool at center stage, guitar cradled with practiced elegance, her smile calibrated precisely for maximum effect. Claire, standing near the edge of the terrace with Vivian's ring still warm in her closed fist, felt something go very still and very cold inside her. The moment the first notes rose into the evening air, she knew them instantly. Every phrase, every hesitation deliberately placed for dramatic effect, every rise and fall of the melody line. She had written this piece note by careful note at her father's workbench when she was 9 years old, humming it into existence long before she'd ever learned to write it down properly. After hearing a fragment of something similar drift once through a neighbor's open window, and spending the following 6 months chasing the rest of it out of her own imagination. That music is stolen, Claire said, and her voice, though not loud, cut through the polite murmur of the crowd with startling clarity. Every head on the terrace turned. Madison's fingers faltered on the strings, the melody stumbling into silence. I beg your pardon, Madison said, recovering quickly, her smile turning brittle at the edges. I said it is stolen, Claire repeated, stepping forward into the open space between the crowd and the stage, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. Every note of it. And the theft is currently taking a bow in front of everyone whose respect you were hoping to buy with it. Ignore her. Barbara's voice rose from somewhere in the crowd, shrill with panic. Jealousy has clearly gone to her head. Then let me prove it, Claire said, instead of asking you to simply believe me. She turned to Madison, something hard and clear settling over her features. That piece has 2 movements, Madison. You've just played the first, the soft introduction. You have never, in all the times I've heard you perform it, played the second. Do you know why? Madison's composure cracked just slightly, just enough for the crowd to notice. Because there is no second movement, she said. It's a complete piece. It isn't, Claire said, because a thief can only ever carry what fits through the window she broke into. Give me the instrument. Don't you dare touch. But Wyatt had already wheeled himself forward close enough to place a steadying hand near the stage, and something in the sheer quiet authority of his presence made even Madison hesitate. Claire took the guitar from her sister's reluctant hand, settled it against herself, with the ease of someone reuniting with an old familiar friend, and began to play. The second movement unfolded across the terrace like something remembered, rather than performed, darker, more searching than the introduction. A long, aching, melodic line that resolved finally into something unmistakably triumphant. The sound of a person finding their way out of a room they'd once believed they'd never leave. When the last note faded, the terrace held itself in absolute silence for a long moment, before a single voice, rich with age and unmistakable authority, rose from the back of the crowd. "That child's name is Claire Sutton," the voice said, "and I would know that piece anywhere on this earth because I am the woman who taught her to play it." The crowd parted as Loretta Combs made her way forward, silver-haired, unhurried, the kind of quiet gravity in her bearing that came only from 4 decades spent shaping the careers of some of the most celebrated musicians the state had ever produced. She stopped beside Claire, resting one weathered hand briefly on her shoulder, and turned to address the stunned terrace. 40 years I have taught music in this state," Loretta said. "Presidents' daughters, concert soloists, prodigies groomed from birth for exactly this kind of room. And in all 40 years I have encountered true, untaught genius exactly once, not in Nashville, not in any conservatory. In a small county, 2 hours from here, in a repair shop that smelled of sawdust, where a barefoot 9-year-old girl heard a fragment of a recording once through a neighbor's open window and composed an answer to it herself, without a single lesson, without a single note of instruction. Her gaze moved to Madison, cold and unwavering. A wealthy family later begged me to take their daughter as a student. I refused at first. The girl had capable hands and no soul behind them. I only agreed when I learned the truth of that household, that the real prodigy was being kept hidden out of sight, so the family's presentable daughter could wear a shine that was never hers to claim. I accepted as a favor to the child they were hiding, hoping that one day through one open door I might help her reach the other." The silence on the terrace had thickened into something close to horror. "Madison Sutton," Loretta said, her voice carrying to every corner of the garden, "you have performed. A piece stolen note for note from the only true student I have ever called a genius. Before this entire gathering, I want it known clearly. You are no student of mine, and you never truly were. Do not use my name again." What followed happened quickly and without mercy, Madison's composure finally shattering completely, a scream tearing loose as she lunged toward Claire in a fury too raw to be contained, security moving swiftly to intervene before any real harm could be done. The entire scene captured, Vivian noted, with grim satisfaction on no fewer than a dozen phones held aloft by guests who would ensure the story spread across Nashville society by morning. "Everything was supposed to be mine," Madison sobbed, restrained now, mascara streaking down a face no longer composed for anyone's approval. "Everything." Wyatt wheeled himself directly into her line of sight, his voice dropping into something low and absolutely final. "You raised your hand against my wife tonight in front of 300 witnesses," he said. "The only reason you are still standing free right now is my mercy, and I promise you there will not be a second offer of it. If you or anyone in your family comes near her again, what follows will make tonight look like a kindness." He turned to the head of security standing nearby, his voice regaining its usual measured calm. "Remove the Sutton family from Belmead's guest lists permanently. They do not set foot on this property again." As the Suttons were escorted, humiliated, and diminished from the grounds, Richard's face gray with the particular devastation of a man watching the last of his social standing evaporate in real time, Barbara clutching Madison's arm with a grip that looked less like comfort than damage. Control. Claire stood at the center of the emptying terrace, the guitar still cradled in her arms. Vivian's family ring pressed warm into her palm, and felt something enormous and long buried finally settle into place inside her. She had spent 26 years being told in 100 small and large ways that her gift belonged to someone else, that her worth was something to be measured against a sister who'd simply been born into the better half of her father's affection. Tonight, in front of the very people whose approval her family had spent a lifetime chasing, that lie had finally publicly come apart. Wyatt reached for her hand, and Claire laced her fingers through his without hesitation, the two of them standing together in the quiet aftermath of the storm they'd just weathered, neither of them yet aware that the true storm, the one that had been building in silence for 6 long years, was waiting for them just a few hours further down the road behind a locked bedroom door neither of them had spoken of since the fight that put it there. That same night, long after the last of Belmead's lights had dimmed behind them and the drive home had passed in a silence, neither of them fully understood the shape of yet Wyatt disappeared into the bedroom alone, while Claire lingered in the kitchen, still wearing Vivian's borrowed ring, still turning over the wreckage and the vindication of the evening in her mind. It was the particular quality of the silence from behind that door, too long, too still, entirely unlike the ordinary quiet of a man readying himself for sleep, that finally sent a current of unease through her. "Wyatt," she called, moving down the hallway. No answer came. She tried the handle and found it locked, the same lock he'd insisted on weeks before in the fight that still sat unresolved between them like a stone neither had managed to move. "Zane Wyatt," she corrected herself, her heart climbing into her throat. as the doctor's warning from weeks earlier rose unbidden in her mind. A locked door and unusual silence. Do not leave him alone. Open this door. Please. Nothing. Then faint a small sound she would never afterward be able to fully describe, not quite a groan, not quite a breath, the sound of a man trying very hard to make no sound at all. Claire did not hesitate a second time. She threw her shoulder against the old wood once, twice, until the cheap lock gave way, and the door swung open into a room lit only by the bathroom's pale glow. What she found there, she would carry gently and without judgment for the rest of her life. Wyatt on the edge of the bed, pale and shaking. A small first aid kit fallen open on the floor beside him. The particular hollow, ashamed look of a man caught in the exact moment he'd spent 6 years, hiding from everyone who'd ever claimed to love him. Don't, he said when he saw her face. Please, just go back out. Let me handle this the way I always have. No, Claire said, and her voice broke on the word even as her hands moved with steady, urgent purpose toward the first aid kit, toward him, refusing entirely to retreat. Not tonight. Not ever again. You'll run, he said, something raw and broken in his voice, now years of carefully maintained composure finally giving way completely. Everyone runs from this part. The doctor warned you. Sam warned you. Even I've been trying to warn you in every quiet, cowardly way I know how that this is what's really underneath everything you've been so determined to love. I cut my own hand once tonight, breaking down this exact door to reach you, Claire said, holding up her palm, a thin line of red, still welling there from the splintered wood. Does that look like running to you? Wyatt stared at her hand, at the blood, at the fierce, unwavering set of her jaw, and something in him, some final exhausted wall he'd been holding upright through sheer force of will for 6 unbroken years, finally completely came down. The pain comes at night like something with teeth, he said, the words tumbling out of him now unguarded for the first time since she'd known him. 6 years, Claire. 6 years of fighting it alone in locked rooms, telling myself that was the only way to protect the people around me from watching it happen. That was the only way I knew how to survive it. The locked rooms are finished, Claire said, kneeling in front of him, taking his hands, both of them gently, deliberately, into her own. Do you hear me? From tonight there is no door in this house that closes against me. Not this one. Not any other. We are going to fight this together every single time it comes for you. And I am not going anywhere, no matter how many nights it takes to prove that to you. Her voice caught fierce and unwavering all at once. I swear it. Neither of them noticed in the raw, unguarded aftermath of that moment the quiet knock at the front door. Leo Danvers, who had driven straight from the gala, the moment he'd learned what had unfolded there, carrying with him a weight he'd held alone for 6 years, and could no longer in good conscience continue to carry. Odessa let him in, and he found Wyatt and Claire still in the bedroom doorway. A few minutes later, Wyatt's composure gathered back around him with visible effort. Claire's hand still firmly laced through his. Madame Claire, Leo said, and something in the careful formality of his address, the particular gravity in his tone, made both of them go still. There's something I've carried for 6 years. I'm only telling you now because I watched you tonight, and something in my spirit is telling me it's finally time to say it, whatever Wyatt's reaction turns out to be. Say it, Wyatt said, quiet, bracing. The accident, Leo said. 6 years ago. It was no accident at all. He let out a long, unsteady breath, the weight of 6 years of silence finally breaking loose. The brake lines on your car were cut. Deliberately. Professionally. On the orders of your uncle Russell Calloway. The room seemed to tilt around the words. His own blood, Claire whispered. There was evidence, Leo continued, forcing himself onward now that the first sentence had broken the dam. A mechanic willing to testify. Your mother knew Wyatt. She knew within days. And she made the decision on her own that a murder investigation inside this family would destroy everything the Calloway name still stood for, the company, the reputation, everything your grandfather built. So the mechanic was paid to disappear and relocate. The file was closed as a mechanical failure. And her own son, burned and broken on that highway, was quietly asked to carry the weight of it in silence for the sake of a family name that had never once in 6 years carried any weight of its own back for him. Wyatt sat very still. Something moving behind his eyes that Claire had never seen there before, not shock exactly, more the terrible hollow confirmation of a suspicion he'd never fully let himself examine. She let me believe it was simply bad luck, he said very quietly. 6 years. She let me carry that alone on top of everything else rather than tell me the truth and risk what it would cost the family to acknowledge it. Chief Connor sits at every family function to this day, Leo said, using the old nickname the staff still whispered for Russell behind closed doors. He's carried the Bible at 2 Calloway weddings since. Nobody has ever once looked at him twice. Claire's grip on Wyatt's hand tightened something fierce and protective, igniting behind her eyes. "Then that changes tonight," she said. "Whatever it costs, however long it takes, Russell Calloway is going to answer for what he did to you. They asked you to swallow fire to protect a name that never once protected you back. I am going to make that name protect you instead. Wyatt, or I am going to help you burn it down and build something better out of the ashes." Wyatt looked at her, his wife, of only a few weeks, kneeling in the wreckage of a door she'd broken down with her own bare hands to reach him, offering him not pity, not fear, but the fierce, unshakable loyalty of someone who had chosen fully, and without illusion, to stand exactly where she was. Standing and felt something in the deepest, most guarded chamber of his heart, finally, after 6 long years, begin to believe it might actually be possible to heal. He did not yet know how much further the truth still had to unravel before the night was through, that Leo's digging into 6 years of buried financial records had turned up one more transaction still waiting to be found, one that would connect his mother's silence about the crash to a second, older betrayal neither he nor Claire had any reason yet to suspect. For tonight it was enough that the locked door stood open and would stay that way. 3 days later, Leo Danvers sat alone in his office long after the rest of the Calloway Stringworks building had gone dark. A stack of financial records spread across his desk in the careful, exhausted disarray of a man who had promised himself he would not stop until the whole truth, not just the part he'd already confessed, was finally laid bare. Building the legal case against Russell Calloway had required him to trace 6 years of shell accounts holding companies and quietly routed transfers, the patient, unglamorous work of forensic accounting, the kind that rarely produced drama-only proof. It was well past midnight when he found the transaction that stopped his breath entirely. Buried 3 layers deep in an account structure, designed expertly to be difficult to trace back to any single person, a wire transfer dated the same week. Wyatt had first come home from the hospital in his wheelchair, $200,000 routed from a holding company. Leo had never once in the 9 years of managing Calloway finances seen used for anything but discreet family matters. The recipient's name struck him like a physical blow. Delilah Marsh. Leo sat back slowly in his chair, the office's fluorescent hum suddenly very loud in the silence, and read the transaction record 3 more times, hoping each time that he'd misunderstood something, that the name belonged to some other Delilah entirely. Some coincidence too cruel to be true. It didn't change on the 4th read. The account it had come from traced back through 2 more careful layers of separation, to a trust controlled exclusively by one person, Eleanor Calloway. He did not sleep that night. He spent it instead cross-referencing dates, confirming what some cold, sick part of him had already understood the moment he'd seen the transfer amount and the timing aligned so precisely that this was not, as he'd first assumed, some earlier act of maternal cruelty unrelated to this accident. It was the same week, the same silence, the same woman who had already 6 years ago made the decision to bury a murder to protect a family name had, in that very same window of time, quietly written a check to make certain her wounded, grieving son had absolutely no one left to trust but the family that controlled every dollar keeping him alive. The next morning, Leo arrived at the duplex before either Wyatt or Claire had finished their coffee, a folder clutched in his hand with the particular grim urgency of a man who understood he was about to detonate something in his oldest friend's life for the 2nd time in a single week, and he would do it anyway, because the alternative, letting the lie stand, had become impossible to live with. Wyatt read the transfer record in silence, his face going through a series of expressions Claire had never once seen from him in the weeks she'd known him. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that dropped all at once past shock into a kind of terrible, quiet stillness that frightened her far, more than any outburst could have. "There's a timeline," Leo said gently when Wyatt didn't speak. "I've laid it all out. The wire went out 4 days after your accident while you were still in surgery, still unconscious for most of it. It cleared into Delilah's account 11 days before she left. That doesn't mean," Wyatt started, his voice rough, grasping visibly for an explanation that wouldn't require the ground beneath him to fully collapse. "I called her," Leo said quietly. "Yesterday. I found a number, I don't fully know how, and I called it before I let myself think too hard about whether I had the right to." She confirmed it, Wyatt. Not defiantly. "She cried actually on the phone, told me she's carried it for 6 years and half wanted someone to finally ask her about it. Your mother came to her the week of the accident, while you were still in intensive care, and made her an offer. $200,000 to disappear completely immediately with no explanation left behind," framed Delilah said as a mercy. Your mother told her a man in your condition would need family who could fully control his recovery without outside complications. She told her you'd be better off in the end believing you'd simply been left rather than knowing you'd been taken from. Claire's hand found Wyatt's across the table gripping hard, and felt him trembling beneath her fingers. Not the trembling of grief. Exactly something closer to the specific, disorienting vertigo of a man discovering that the single wound he'd built his entire adult identity around, the wound that had taught him he wasn't worth staying for, had never actually been real at all. It had been manufactured, purchased, delivered to him deliberately, at the exact moment he was most broken, and least able to question it by the one person whose love he'd never once thought to doubt. She didn't just cover up what Russell did to me, Wyatt said very slowly, each word arriving as though it had to travel an enormous distance to reach his mouth. She used it. She used the accident while I was still unconscious to make sure I had nothing left, standing between me and total dependence on this family's money and this family's silence. The crash wasn't the only thing that happened to me that week. His voice cracked finally. 6 years of carefully maintained composure breaking open all at once. My own mother took the last thing I had left on purpose, while I couldn't even stand up to stop her. He didn't rage. That was in some ways the most frightening part. Claire had braced for shouting for something violent and cathartic, and instead watched Wyatt go very still and very quiet, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. She couldn't follow him, into the particular terrible calm of a man whose entire understanding of his own life had just been rewritten from the ground up. Wyatt, Claire said softly, gripping his hand tighter. Look at me. He did slowly, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't anger, not yet, but something far more fragile. The exposed, disbelieving grief of a boy who'd once wrapped himself in a single shared blanket against a Tennessee winter, and never once doubted in all those cold nights that the people around him loved him as fully as they were able. That certainty, the last untouched piece of his childhood, had just been taken from him too. 6 years, he said, barely above a whisper. 6 years I thought I wasn't enough to stay for. 6 years I let that belief build every wall I've ever put up, every reason I gave myself not to trust anyone fully again. Sam's warnings, my own fear the night I locked that door against you. All of it built on a lie my own mother paid $200,000 to manufacture. Claire moved from her chair to kneel in front of him, taking his face gently between her hands, forcing the connection he seemed for a moment in danger of drifting entirely away from. Then let it go, she said, fierce and steady. Not the anger you're allowed, every ounce of that, and I'll stand beside you through every bit of it, however long it takes. But the lie, Wyatt, the belief that you weren't enough, that was never true. It was never true for a single day of the 6 years you carried it. You are allowed to finally put it down. Leo, watching from the doorway, quietly gathered the folder of records and stepped back, giving them the room they needed, though his own hands were unsteady with the weight of what he'd just set in motion. He had told himself walking up the porch steps that morning that Wyatt deserved the truth, no matter the cost of delivering it. Watching his oldest friend's entire understanding of himself crack open in real time, he found himself hoping with an intensity that surprised him, that the truth would prove in the end to be worth what it had just cost. Outside the kitchen window, the ordinary Tennessee morning continued, indifferent to the wreckage unfolding within traffic. Passing on the street, a bird calling somewhere in Odessa's garden, the whole unremarkable machinery of a day that had no idea it had just become the hinge on which the rest of Wyatt Calloway's life would turn. Somewhere across the city, Eleanor Calloway sat down to her own quiet breakfast, entirely unaware that the 6-year silence she had built her son's isolation upon had finally irrevocably come undone. The following week, the Calloway Stringworks boardroom filled slowly, chairs scraping against old hardwood floors, sunlight slanting through tall factory windows onto a long table that had for 6 years rarely seen its chairman in person. Cool. Word had gone out quietly the night before through Leo, through Sam, through a summons. No one on the board had felt able to refuse. Wyatt Calloway would be attending in person, and he would be bringing his wife. Russell Calloway arrived last unhurried, a folder of his own tucked beneath one arm, the same cold appraising calm he'd worn across the club dinner table from Brett Sanders weeks earlier. He had spent days quietly circulating his letter, questioning his nephew's judgment, certain the board's discomfort would do the rest of the work for him. He had not accounted for what waited for him in that room. Eleanor Calloway sat near the head of the table, drawn there by a message from her son that had contained only 4 words. Come. It's time. Words she had spent a sleepless night trying and failing to decode, some old maternal instinct, warning her too late that whatever was coming had already left her hands. Wyatt wheeled himself to the head of the table, Claire beside him, Leo and Sam standing just behind, and set a single folder down in front of him without opening it. I have spent 6 years letting this family believe I was too fragile, too dependent, too broken to be trusted with the whole truth of what happened to me, Wyatt said, and his voice quiet as it was carried to every corner of the silent room. I know now why that belief was so carefully protected. It was never meant to protect me at all. He looked at Russell first. The brakes on my car were cut on your orders 6 years ago to clear a path to a company you believed should have been yours. I have the mechanic's statement. I have the financial trail. I have given all of it to the district attorney's office as of this morning, along with formal notice to this board that you are removed effective immediately from every position and every share you hold in this company. Russell's composure cracked for the first time and the whole ordeal, color draining from his face as the weight of the words landed. He opened his mouth to argue, and found in the silence of a room full of people who had just heard the evidence laid plainly on the table that there was nothing left to say. Then Wyatt turned to his mother, and the room seemed to hold its breath along with her. I know what you did after the accident too, he said, quieter now, the anger giving way to something rawer, harder to watch. I know about the $200,000. I know you paid Delilah to disappear while I was still unconscious in a hospital bed, so that when I woke up broken and afraid, I would have no one left to trust except the family controlling every dollar, keeping me alive. You didn't just cover up what your brother-in-law did to me, Mother. You used it. You built 6 years of my isolation on purpose, and let me believe every single one of those years that I simply wasn't enough to be loved. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure finally completely gave way. Tears she had likely not allowed herself in years slid down her face unchecked in front of the entire board. I told myself I was protecting the family, she said, her voice breaking. Protecting you. I convinced myself a scandal would destroy everything your father built, and that you would heal faster with fewer complications around you. I told myself so many versions of that lie, Wyatt, that some nights I nearly believed it myself. You don't have to convince me it felt true to you, Wyatt said. I understand better than most people ever will how easy it is to build a life around a story that lets you avoid the harder truth underneath it. I did the same thing for 6 years about my own worth. He paused, something shifting visibly in him, the anger settling at last into something steadier. I have every legal right sitting in this chair today to destroy both of you completely. The evidence is here. The board would support it. Nobody in this room would blink. He let the silence stretch long enough that even Russell seemed to brace for the blow. I'm not going to, Wyatt said finally. Not because either of you have earned it. You haven't. But because I have finally learned something this last month that 6 years of silence and isolation never once taught me, that using power to punish doesn't heal the thing that was actually broken in the first place. It just adds another wound to carry. He looked at Russell. You will face the district attorney, and you will face whatever a jury of this state's citizens decides you deserve. That part is no longer mine to forgive. Then to his mother, gentler now, though no less resolute, you will keep the Calloway name. But you will spend whatever years you have left making it mean something worth protecting, starting with fully funding the youth music program in the county where my wife grew up in her father's name publicly, permanently, not as penance, as the beginning of actually becoming the mother I always needed you to be. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, and something passed between mother and son in that silence that was not quite forgiveness yet, but was unmistakably the first honest step toward it either of them had taken in 6 long years. Later that evening, back at the small duplex that had somehow in the space of a few short months become the truest home either of them had ever known, Claire found Wyatt on the front porch watching the sun go down behind the honeysuckle fence. She sat beside him, and without either of them quite planning it, he reached for the brake of his wheelchair, gripped the porch railing with one hand and her steady shoulder with the other, and rose slowly, unsteadily, braced by 6 years of physical therapy and one determined woman's stubborn devotion to stand for the first time since the night his car went off the Cumberland Parkway. It wasn't a miracle. The doctors would later explain it carefully, cautiously, as a combination of healed tissue, months of quiet exercises Claire had learned in a Vanderbilt clinic and practiced on him every single night, without ever once being asked to stop, and a nervous system finally calm enough for the first time in years to let his body attempt what fear alone had kept it from trying. It was simply a man who had finally let someone love every scarred, guarded, unbreakable piece of him and discovered that it was enough to help him stand. Years later, the youth music program at Suttons String and Repair, reopened, rebuilt, and funded in full by the Calloway Family Foundation, would send its first graduating class of scholarship students off to conservatories across the country, Framed photograph of a barefoot 9-year-old prodigy hanging above the front counter beside a repair tag that read in careful looping handwriting, "No charge. Good men shouldn't have to choose between eating and keeping their music." And that, in the end, is the truest lesson this whole story leaves behind. Wealth never healed Wyatt Calloway. Power never healed him either, not the kind that could terminate contracts or freeze a family's fortune overnight. What healed him was one woman who refused to leave when the door was locked, one old friend who was brave enough to say he'd been wrong, and the simple, stubborn choice to forgive, not because someone else deserved it, but because carrying that weight alone had already cost him enough. True belonging was never about how much a person has. It was about someone finally staying long enough to see all of it, the scars, the fear, the quiet, guarded places, and choosing to remain anyway. So we would love to know, dear friends watching tonight, what lesson did you take away from Wyatt and Claire's story? Was it about the danger of letting old wounds decide who we trust? About the quiet, patient power of simply staying? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts with us. We truly want to hear them. And if this story moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need it today. Leave us a comment and subscribe so you never miss the next story we bring to life. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We'll see you in the next video. This story is a work of fiction created with the help of artificial intelligence. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental.